With this oil painting of the casting scene in the river with the conifer forest behind, I'm building up layers. So I've built up a layer of thin cerulean blue mixed with ultramarine little white, tiny bit of crimson, then built up darker layers on top of that, trying to keep the layers translucent so that you can still see a bit of the drawing. What I was hoping to do was layer dark first and then light, so I'm trying to underpaint most of this. Up on the top left, was wondering about painting into the branches, since they are behind and the brighter leaf is in front, so that would involve possibly a watercolour brush, a little watercolour brush like this, and a thin layer of paint. I can still find the drawing there. And this is thinned with a little turpentine or zest it. So I'm going to use the brush at a shallow angle. It's got to be in front of those trees as well. These branches. And then there's a brightly coloured leaf. Go on top of that. Try and get that a little bit smoother. Just get this to flow off the brush. So all this lighter colour, that's very slippery, it's got a lot of medium with the colour, mixture, crimson, ultramarine and yellow ochre, making this colour. You've got a bit of a foot there. These branches just sort of disappear into the forest. Brush control, different angles of the brush, especially with these longer branches. So I'll just roll and twist, turn the brush a little bit, turning the brush like that, and drawing into these long, thin branches. That's about it. Yeah, there are other branches there. With the figure, I would just like to work a little bit more into it. I've already painted some of the underpainting behind the figure. Since the figure is the focal point, I wondered about going into it with more detail. And this little brush. This is pretty much the opposite of everything else that's in this subject. So the bag, pretty dark there, strap. That's a mixture of ultramarine, crimson, a little bit of white and some yellow ochre. I've got a sort of blue-grey with cerulean blue, ultramarine and crimson. I'm going to have a go at painting the upper part with that more cerulean blue based colour. A little bit of light falling on that top. There's a hood, I think, and creases coming down the arm here. That's the light colour, I think, would follow this. It's not all the same colour. Quite a baggy, loose-fitting garment. So it goes into the hand, and then the hat is a similar colour. So kind of a flat top. And I suppose much darker just there. Get rid of the excess on the brush. A mixture of yellow ochre and crimson. These are all quite thin mixes. In the shadow here. And that there is an edge of light on there, there's quite a lot of light to go onto that. Also with the hand there's quite a lot of light. Again, yellow ochre and crimson. So it seems maybe too dark, it seems too strong at this stage, but I think that's a tradition in oils would be to go from dark to light. So the lower part, the trouser, here, waders, that's going to be a slightly darker mix with more ochre and less crimson and ultramarine. And you can see the kind of way that fabric has creased a little bit around the figure, around the cylinder of the leg there. I'm just going to leave that out. Then this leg is against the current, so you've got, let's see if I can pick that up a bit. Kind of foam there, and the other leg I think is a bit lost in the image. But that's the leg that the weight is being supported on. So it's all quite thin colour, a little bit of a curve in that. I have used some scratching as well into the water here on wet, so that's the end of the brush. That's called a little bit of sgraffito, perhaps, this sort of thing. Let's zoom out of that, see what it's like further back. So that leaves this area. I've left out this area of white water, but I've brushed this with a large brush onto here to sort of blur and blend a little bit into these lost smoky edges along the back here. A little bit of blurring and blending. What I'd like to do with the big brush is take a mix of violet grey, ultramarine, ochre and crimson, and use that to underpaint the foreground rocks. So these are quite block-like rocks, square edges, and the flat brush is pretty good for that. Just finding these mixes. Yeah, so that's quite slippery. I can still see the drawing through this. In fact, the rocks are a bit lighter in places, so that means I can bring light back out of this. there are some ferns on these rocks which could be put in later as they are lighter. Bring that down. I'm being quite careful around the edge of this because obviously that's the edge against the water. This is a preliminary layer of colour. A little bit of water just there. Changing the brush, changing the direction of the brush, and brushing this out. That's thinned with medium, and the colour therefore should, this layer, will stay wet for a little while, but it just enables the stretching of the medium, of the colour rather, without it disintegrating, which it can do with water if you mix it with water. So I'm going to just sort of brush that out a little bit. There are darker shapes within this pile of rocks, and there are also rocks in the stream which are quite dark. There's one there, for example, and this little brush on top of the general description of water here with the wet on wet. So there's a little bit there perhaps. Go back in with the small brush. There's some rocks here. There's a large rock there. So this is all in the mid to dark tone range. And these rocks in here, I put down a general sort of description on these rocks on the left, and now would be an opportunity to pick out a few that are maybe a bit darker in shadow. This is also a bit darker. That part there is a little bit darker. So I can see where the drawing is, and I can also see later on where to add light, which in the tradition of oil painting would follow the mid to dark tone layers. So I take a bit of time over painting in some of these rocks. So all the sunlit parts would go on top of this. So this is the middle distance, the trees were the far distance, and the mid distance compared to the trees would have a little more sharpness, a little more focus. So I just carry on building that up. Takes a little while to build it all up. But I can still see the drawing of those rocks behind this thin wash, and that's the idea of these thin underpainting tints, to be able to see some of the drawing through that, and for those layers to dry more quickly.